Greetings, everyone. My name is Mitch Thompson. I'm Vice President of the Humanists of Minnesota, and I want to welcome you to our April community gathering. It's wonderful to see you all, especially people who are new here. I see a lot of familiar faces, but maybe a few new people. I want to extend a special welcome to you if you're new, and if you have any questions about our organization. You see a lot of us with name tags, which I've lost mine, but you see a lot of people with name tags. They're on the board and such. They can give you some information about who we are and what we do, which I will also give you a little bit of information about that right now. HumanistsMN is a secular community for ethical living. We are committed to the well-being of all and the sustainability of the planet, which fits in well today, embracing the concept of human flourishing. We seek to champion secular and moral, civic, and political leadership. We are a home for those looking for a community of naturally curious, compassionate, and rational people who gather for friendship, personal growth, doing good together, and normalizing the non-religious naturalist worldview. That's a mouthful. We are also a very active organization. We organize primarily through Meetup, which probably most of you found out about that through this. If you didn't, you should join that because there's a lot of activities that we do every month. There's a lot of stuff going on around HumanistsMN. We are an all-volunteer nonprofit. We depend on the service and generosity of our members and friends to further our mission. We have many volunteer opportunities such as membership, marketing, programming, and social action, things about website stuff and dealing with media-related things. You can reach out to Audrey Kingstrom or anyone on the board about this. And this part's wrong. You can also go to our website at HumanistMN to learn more about us or explore opportunities to get involved. There you can also sign up for our newsletter or support us by becoming a dues-paying member, which that would be great. The more members we have, the stronger we are. A bit of housekeeping. The bathrooms are located downstairs, or if you go out here and go to the left, there's 3 of them at the end of the hallway. And I want to go back a little bit to about some of the events coming up. We have 2 Day of Reason events coming up here, May 2nd and May 3rd, right? 2nd and 3rd? Did I get that right? Okay, I didn't write that down here. So May 2nd is a Tuesday. We're having a book signing event with Matthew Siddell. Andrew Siddell. I should have written more of this part down. I was going to wing it, and I am, apparently. That's May 2nd at Sweeney's in St. Paul. And we have a limited number of people that can go to that. So if you want to go, please get signed up on it now. Should be really fun and exciting. We were just there checking the place out yesterday, and we stayed and had a drink, and we had a very good time. So, but he will be doing a little talk and doing a book signing. We have 40 books to sell. So, and then on the 3rd, we will actually be at the Capitol in the morning doing a rally, which is important because we have a secular caucus that we helped convene, that we want to show them that there's a lot of people interested in this, in their caucus that they've helped form. So that event is May 3rd, which you can also find more about it through Meetup. There'll be coffee and some donuts or something of that. I don't know, we've decided 100% what food, but it'll be that kind of thing. And it would be really great to have a big turnout for that. It's quick and it's kind of fun. It's at the Capitol. There's some energy there. So we will have a speaker today, which Molly will introduce, but after that, we will have a Q&A session, but then we'll have a social hour. There'll be food and wine and that type of stuff out there. If you can contribute a little bit to help paying for that, that's great. We just roll it all back into trying to have, a good amount of stuff for the next meeting. So, and I am going to introduce Christine Retqua. She is going to talk about some upcoming things with one of the committees she works on. Thanks.
Thank you, Mitch. Good afternoon. I'm Christine Retqua, co-chair of Humanist in Action Committee with my good friend Marcy, and we do a range of kinds of things. One is service, community service. What do we do in the community to help it be a better place out there? And speaking of dues, that's one place the dues go. It helps fund a scholarship. It helps fund the supplies that we need to do some of these activities. That's where that action is. The other half of it includes legislative action, because the rules that are made at the Capitol matter, kind of like Mitch was just alluding to. And I'm sure you all humanists, you all vote, don't you? Like good humanists, and you like to be informed when you vote. So what I'm offering for you today is, in case you don't happen to know who your legislator is or know so much about them, I want to take you to their webpage, and you can sign up for their newsletter so you'll get a better sense of what's on their mind. And I have postcards to send a message to them on the subjects of voting/elections, and also some on environment. These are the same bills that we were advocating for last month, and so if you're sure you filled out that one, then you don't need to come back for that. But we want to express our voice. We want to help this world have the humanist values. I really believe strongly that that is the world that is a better place for all. Help everyone thrive. So appreciate your action and engagement on all of these fronts. And is it Molly's turn to introduce? Mitch, all right.
I wanted to say the book signing. The book is about, I can't remember what it's called, but it's about basically how the Supreme Court is kind of starting to screw us over, I believe is kind of the premise of the book. So it should be very interesting. So I have a little bit of business that we need to deal with. I was the chair for the nominations committee for our board. And that committee consisted of myself, Audrey Kingstrom, and Nick Hayland. And we went through a process to figure out who will be on the slate at our annual meeting in May, which is May 20th. So the nominations committee is recommending the following candidates for the May election. Our current treasurer, John Walker, who also is doing our AV in the back there, he has just finished a 2-year term, and he would like to do another one, and we would like to have him. Stephanie Schwinn, who's currently at large, will move up to secretary. Unfortunately, Dave, our current secretary, has gone through his 8 years that he can be on the board. Per our bylaws, in odd number years, we elect 3 at-large members, and we are nominating the following at-large members to serve another 2-year term. So these people are currently board members as well. Suzanne Perry, Jerry Smith, and Nick Hayland. With Stephanie vacating her at-large board position midterm to run for secretary, there is a 1-year term remaining, and we are nominating Audrey Kingstrom to fill that position for 1 year. Audrey has previously been on the board. She was a board president, and she's very involved in a lot of the programming that we do here with HumanistMN. And she's agreed to run, to serve for another year at least. Again, per our bylaws, we will now entertain any nominations from the floor. So if you have just been dying to nominate yourself to be on the board, or somebody else, this would be the time at which to do it. And I have a bunch of contingencies if somebody nominates himself that I can skip. Okay, well, let's see how we do this. Going once? Going twice? Okay, all right. So that will be the slate that we will recommend at our May 20th meeting, which will be here at FUS. We will be downstairs. It'll be a lot less formal. There is no speaker per se, but there will be some pizza and the beverages and those kind of things. And then we're still working out some other things that might happen. So I think that ends this then. So there's a question. I skipped something.
I can hold about 2 things in my head before I forget them all. And this was, again, to help folks in our community Bob Adderhold, who many of you know, has been coordinating trying to come together and see who is interested in helping some folks from Ukraine. Help support a Ukrainian family being one or more people. So please see Bob or me, if you can remember me better, to let us know if you want to be part of helping that. We need a committee of people doing several things. Some people have already responded to a survey of what they're interested in. He has your name, but please do help some folks in our community who are really struggling, as you might imagine. Thank you.
And I think, Molly, if you want to come up and introduce our speaker for today. And thank you.
Okay. J. Drake Hamilton is Fresh Energy's Senior Director of Science Policy. She's an expert in climate and energy policy at the state and national level, and is driving bold policy solutions for a just carbon-free future. In November 2022, she showcased Minnesota's work twice on the global stage at the UN Global Climate Summit in Egypt, including leading a multinational panel. In November 2023, she will bring more leadership to the 28th Climate Summit in the United Arab Emirates. The goal is to pass global financing for the poorest nations and get faster, deeper carbon reduction from every nation in the world. Jay gives 50 invited presentations in Minnesota each year. In 2023, she will give the keynote address to 500 youth from across our state, and in May, she will receive an award as the leading climate scientist in Minnesota. Minneapolis-St. Paul magazine named J. Drake Hamilton as one of the 100 Minnesotans who make things happen. And now we're going to hear Jay.
And I'm going to have to ask Bob, maybe. This now has 2 screens, and he's going to solve that. Thank you, and thanks to Molly for inviting me to be here today. I'm J. Drake Hamilton. My name is confusing. My J is a nickname for Janet, my given name. But I think a guy I was dating in college used to call me J, and I really liked the J, and I kept it. And so that's what I know as professionally. So I'm going to talk until about 4 today, and then I'm going to take your questions from 4 to 4:30. So I'm looking forward to those. But remember, you can call me Jay. And this is good news. Every bit of this is breaking, leading news for Minnesota. So you don't have to be glum. I can see the light up there, so it's artificial, but it feels great. Thank you to everyone for coming today. You may want to jot down my email address, because if you don't get to the question before 5 p.m. or need to leave early, you can always email me. Or you can also pick up our newsletter out of the door where you signed in. And this will have our website, which is www.fresh-energy.org. I'm going to tell you just a few stories today, but there are many more on our website. And they tell you how Fresh Energy works, and you can see how we've been pretty successful. And I'll get to that in a moment. So we're 30 years old. I was the first person hired by our executive director, the first person. And for a couple of years, there were 2.5 of us. 2 of us full-time and 1 part-time intern for several years. Now we have almost 40 people full-time. And they all have specialties. They're all fantastic, but we're all working to achieve equitable, carbon-neutral economies. And this is the third paragraph is the one I added, because to understand how fresh energy works, first of all, it's very important that we're a nonpartisan, nonprofit, based in Minnesota. We are practical. We pull every lever. That's from the guy who taught me physics. He was Brit. So we're looking for every lever we can pull. And we want to reach for that highest lever with all of our strength. So I'll give you some examples of that. Because sometimes I go out and give this talk, and it ends with the last person asking, what is the one simple thing we can do to solve global warming? And there's no answer to that, because we have to do everything to manifestly change everything we do. But we work, nothing we have ever accomplished has been done by one person alone. It is done by hundreds of partnerships, thousands probably, and many, many different alliances. Some that we joined with, some of which we started, and together we have all been very successful in Minnesota. And I'm going to be talking about the long journey we're starting on now, because we have just started that journey of getting to, before 2040, to see that 100% of our energy is coming from carbon-free energy. That's a big, big deal. All right. First, I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about my work internationally, because this is the COP that I went to last November, and it's in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. There are about 19,000 people there from 195 countries, and I had 2 slots on 2 different global stages where people from anywhere in the world who could be listening in from their home country even. So I knew that I had 2 chances. And what I wanted to represent there was Minnesota. So this is a panel of people I brought together. And you'll notice from the title, this was about Minnesota's role in speeding decarbonization of the US Midwest. Because we needed to stake our foot in the game and say, we are from Minnesota, we are Midwesterners, and let me tell you, this will be the 8th time this year when I go back to the International Conference on Climate Change. This year it'll be in the United Arab Emirates, which is a petro-state. But every time I go to one of these, the first time I went was about 15 years ago, and people found out I was from the US, and especially that I was from Minnesota. And people came up to me and said, hi Jay, I want to talk to you because you're in Minnesota. And that was a little strange to be hearing in Montreal. But I learned quickly that people from 195 countries who go to international climate summits are all very aware of the geography of Minnesota, and especially the geography of the United States. And especially they are experts in the political geography of the US. And one of the first people who wanted to have coffee with me, he said, Jay, he called me Jay right away, so he knew it. And he said, Jay, as you well know, nothing that is decided on in the US by the ultra-liberal state of California, or on the very liberal parts and progressive parts of Massachusetts, make any difference to what happens in Washington, D.C. Because we well know that there are 4 rather purple states in the Midwest. who most people in Washington, D.C. look to and see what direction they want the country to go. And those 4 states, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Illinois. And now, regularly, at about 12 meetings or webinars a year, headed by the Biden administration, I hear those same 4 states called out. So be very proud we are in Minnesota, because we really make a difference. And you can see from these pictures, I was delighted to get on our panel from Little Minnesota. I went in to look who at the University of Minnesota was sending to the climate conference. And one of those was a guy I'd never met before, Dr. Namfa. And he is an economist, and he is originally from the Gambia. Do you know the Gambia is the smallest nation state in Africa? And he came to Minnesota to get his master's degree and his PhD in economics. And he's still here, and he teaches here. And he was the first one I asked to join me. And he said, let's get together and talk about it. I'd love to work with you. And so we had a great first conversation. And he also brought a number of people to our global stage in Egypt. About 20 citizens from the Gambia were there. And they asked us questions throughout the talk. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to demonstrate to the world the diversity of people in Minnesota who really care about climate change and what we're doing. And this is the most important slide I used in those 2 global stages. It's a slide I created from 2 data sets, and you wanted you to look at the Midwest, the 12 states in the Midwest. Now, if you have grown up in another part of the Midwest, or like me, have relatives in North Dakota, our next neighbor, you know that North Dakota is really different from Minnesota in politics, in energy. And yet you see that amount. 26% of the US's greenhouse gas emissions are put into the atmosphere by those 12 Minnesota and other states. 26%. So the first way to read that map is to say, well, wait a minute. I know that our President Biden has announced in Scotland at the last Conference of Parties, he announced in Scotland and promised the 195 countries of the world that we would commit to, by 2030, we will reduce our greenhouse gases by at least 50% by 2030. Now, when you look at these numbers, that 26% of those gases come from the Midwest. Well, I can show you this if I have longer than half an hour, but we need to essentially decarbonize every sector of the economy of Minnesota and convince those sectors in all the other states to decarbonize if we're going to meet this commitment. Now look at the chart on the left side. Now, of course, I know very well that the Midwest is not a country. But if it were a country, we emit so many greenhouse gases that we would rank somewhere between 4th and 5th place. We would be somewhere between Russia and Japan. Now, when I first showed this graph, a woman from Minnesota was in our audience, and I know her. And she came up to me afterwards and she said, "You must have got those numbers of that map wrong, Jay." Now, she knows me better than that. So she knows I'm very careful about my numbers. And I always update this slide every year because the numbers have changed. And this says that the 12 states of the Midwest are a big part of the problem. So that's why Minnesota sends so many people to the international climate summits, because we know we have a lot of skin in the game and we want to take a leadership position. All right. The other thing I really like about going to the international conference is that I don't know what reasons, but from the first day I went to an international climate summit in Montreal about 15 years ago, I got invited to a very unknown meeting, and it was a meeting of no more than 12 people in the room. All of them were Americans. Half of them were diplomats leading our diplomacy at the World Summit. This is the guy who was most recently there, who was there in Egypt with me. This is John Kerry. Everyone knows his name, right? You know his many important jobs. Now he has this great title, Special Presidential Envoy for Climate. He is our lead negotiator. So he had this group of about 5 of his diplomats. And the other 6 people in the room were just from interesting states in the US, including Minnesota. So that's why I've been invited to all of those meetings that I've gone to internationally. And I went there this year. And I sat down with John Kerry. And I had this special power, 2 special powers. So I had met with him and this group of 12 people in a room in Paris. Remember when the Paris Agreement was called forward? That was in 2015. I was there with John Kerry. We were in a room, the table in the room was about the size of this piano. And it had 12 people around it. And we only had 1 hour. And around us, the walls of the room, which was temporary, the plywood walls, there were masses of people outside the room. And they would occasionally put their fists against the wall. Or sometimes they would shout, because they were trying to shout things at everyone else. They didn't know who was in the room. They weren't complaining about us, but we were trying to hear one another. And I was very interested in learning more about successful diplomacy from John Kerry. But you know what? He was as interested in hearing what the citizens of the United States had to say. So last year, 2 years ago, when I was in Glasgow and had been invited to another meeting, a larger meeting with John Kerry, you know what? I used my first power, which was I always get to places early. That's what my father told me to do. And that's what I've always done. So when I got to a 9 a.m. meeting, and I got there about 8:45, I checked in, got to the room was empty. But I counted how many chairs were in the room, and I knew that 100 people would be there. And then I saw the big stage in front of me. I picked this chair with the best sight lines for who would be on that stage. And I sat in the front row. And then, 5 minutes before anyone else was in the room, who walks out on the stage? John Kerry. So what did I do? I got right up. I went to say hello to John Kerry. We touched elbows, remember? This was during COVID, the heart of COVID. And then I held up my very big badge, which had my name very large. And if your name was J. Drake Hamilton, people sometimes remember it because it's so weird. I said, "Do you remember me from Paris?" And he said, "Tell me about that meeting." And I described the piano-sized table surrounded by plywood walls. And I said, "And I'm from Minnesota." And he said, "I remember you had some interesting things to tell me about Minnesota. Tell me how Minnesota is doing now." And we spent 5 whole minutes first talking about Minnesota. So that's the kind of guy he is. But he also gave me permission to tell you all, if you have any questions about what is keeping John Kerry awake at night, I can tell you this, because he is trying to teach other people how to be diplomats. And he's looking for help. All right. But my 2 secrets were I had this very unusual name and people remember it sometimes. And I remembered to get there early. So I would advise everyone to do that too. Now, when you're talking about decarbonization, this is called the 7 key pillars of decarbonization. It was written by a Turkish economist who heads up the International Energy Agency. He's the best economist I know for explaining what we need to do to really slow down climate change. And he said that there are at least 7 things. You can read them now. I'll be talking about some of them for the next half an hour. And what this list means is there is no one simple thing you can do to slow down global warming and make a difference. You need to do all 7 of these things. So that means we're going to need a lot of people out working on this. Fortunately, we have lots of people in Minnesota, and we are now passing laws. I would not be surprised if today the governor were signing the most recent law to be taken from the Senate and the House and sent directly to for the signature of the governor. So, just use your one example, where Minnesota started. We first took a very early lead on renewable energy. And now we've been joined by most of the world. Last year, 85% of new electricity generated globally was from renewable energy. That is a way to say we are winning now. It also means we are just starting. But it's a good thing that we have our toes on the ladder and we're clinging to it. And we're trying to build more ladders up out of this problem. All right. Now, of course, we have had 2 or 3 very utterly astonishing laws passed by the US Congress. The first one was passed in the fall of 2021. And this is known most normally as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. It brought a lot of new money from the federal government to state governments to build new infrastructure like making roads work better, making public transit work better, and to make bridges work well, but many other parts of energy infrastructure. And it's bipartisan. It is a law that passed and was voted yes to by a large number of both Republicans and Democrats, finally. And then people were waiting for the second law to be passed. This used to be known by a number of names. When it finally passed, it was called the Inflation Reduction Act. Some people insist on calling it IRA because they think IRA sounds like someone who could be your friend. And this really is your friend because IRA contains most of the language that creates and funds programs to fight for clean energy and to successfully fight against climate crises. And this law was supposed to be passed right after the first one was passed in 2021. And then you may have been reading the newspapers then, because there was a guy on the Democratic side of the US Senate, Joe Manchin from West Virginia. My dad grew up in West Virginia, so I know West Virginia. And he wasn't wanting to do anything really on climate change. And then suddenly, when I was in Washington, D.C. in July of 2022, I was supposed to have a meeting the next day with Senator Tina Smith's office, our junior senator. And I got a call and they said, Jay, we have some good news and some bad news. The bad news is we can't meet with you tomorrow because we're going to announce that sometime within the 2 weeks, we're going to be passing the Inflation Reduction Act. And it was written largely by our U.S. Senator Tina Smith and our #1 climate employee, whose name is Dr. Peter Wyckoff. I've mentioned his name because you're going to be hearing it a lot recently, because 10 days ago, he left Tina Smith's office and he was offered an assistant commissioner job at the Minnesota Department of Commerce. He's going to be in charge of taking the money from the feds that the feds want to award to Minnesota projects and add to that some money that Minnesota has now said it's going to give to match that funding and make it work. He's a biologist. He's also a damn fine politician. And he's going to be leading this program. So he's just been there about 10 days now. And I think he'll wait for the legislature to wind up, and then you'll be hearing a lot from him. And he will be a go-to person that I'll send a lot of people to. And I'll tell you my side story of that bill. And I heard this on the phone in July of 2022. I said, what happened? And it was, remember Senator Joe Manchin? A Democrat. And then the other Democrat that I know in the legislature, in the U.S. Senate, is a guy named Chuck Schumer. I'm from New York. He was my senator. He's about 9 or 11 years older than me. The first time I went to the capital of New York State in Albany, to the legislature, the first legislator I met in person when I was about 14 or 15, was Chuck Schumer. And so now he's gone from, he got together with Senator Manchin, and they decided we need to have about 2 weeks worth of, hours worth of conversations to see what we can agree on to get this climate law passed. And then they both decided, let's make our meeting secret. So they met in the basement of the Capitol. They didn't tell anyone what they were doing. Well, they told Senator Tina Smith, who had written most of this law. But it wasn't a public thing. And they met in little rooms, basically closet-sized with no windows. And so I understand if people were looking closely enough, they could see these people heading toward the same room. And they agreed. They reached an agreement. And so this became law in 2022. So this is one page of the things that are in the law most pertinent to climate change. These are tax credits and electrification money saving for things like energy audits, windows, doors, electrical panels. You might find out what I found out when I started looking for my electric vehicle. I looked at my electric panel, and it was immediately obvious to me it wasn't capable of charging my electric vehicle on it. So I knew I needed to get a new and expensive electric panel because I'm aiming to electrify my whole household. And $1,200 for weatherization. And 40% of that money is going to go to low-income households. The 40% of people who are under-resourced and need to be brought up to equity with the rest of us. And look at all that. And in addition, there is up to $2,000 of annual credits that are enough to help you buy an air source heat pump, which can both heat and cool your house using electricity. Or $2,000 for a heat pump water heater, which I got a long time before this, about 5 years ago. And I came to a talk like this in the summer, and the first thing I said to that group of people was, "Good afternoon, everyone. You might have been happy how I got my shower this morning. In my house, I got a nice hot shower, and my heat pump water heater used electricity to do that and was 3 times more efficient than my last water heater. And you know how I get all the electricity in my house? It all comes from 100% wind power. So I took a wind power shower this morning and did it again this morning too. And you should all be able to do this too. And the most wonderful sentence on this chart is that the same amount of money is going to be available to every one of you. And the credit will reset January 1 of next year. So you'll be able to spend more and get more. And so now, for the very first time, we can really say, finally, the U.S. is spending enough money and that money will be available at least till 2032. So that's all very good news. And in addition, there's an extra $4.1 trillion. Here you can see some of the amounts. The amount going to solar and wind energy, $28 billion a year going to carbon capture, transmission lines to get solar and wind energy from the places that they're largely produced, which is largely rural America, and bring them to cities like ours. Consumer technologies, and the last bullet point was actually specifically written by Senator Tina Smith, because she has a special interest in rural Minnesota, and she sees horrid disequities between rural Minnesota and urban Minnesota. And she created a program within IRA that spends billions of dollars to go to rural electric co-ops for clean energy and electric grid updates. That is huge. There are many communities across Minnesota now who are planning getting some of this money and doing wonderful things with it. Okay, now the Secretary of Energy is now Jennifer Granholm. Remember those 4 states in Minnesota we're talking about? She used to be the governor of Michigan, and now she's our Secretary of Energy. She's actually been to our office. We know her personally. And she said this IRA will emit 1 billion fewer tons of greenhouse gases a year by 2030. That is huge. And so she has said in every speech she's been giving, we should think about deploying IRA now. Deploy, deploy, deploy. You don't have to do it all in 1 year, but you can start thinking about what you can do in your own home and how you should talk to your neighbors and your friends and your relatives about doing this. Because this is what means we are all in and we're all working to fight climate change at the scale and at the pace that is needed. All right. So the IRA itself invests a year, about $370 billion in American climate policies and carbon reduction. That's amazing. Now, switching back to Minnesota again. This is from a quiz I used to give some young people that I talked to. In 2035, I asked them, what percentage of electricity in Minnesota is forecast to be generated from burning coal? If I were asking this question of anyone, like when I came to Minnesota to go to graduate school in 1984. I wasn't even asking this question, but the answer would be almost 100% of it is burning coal in Minnesota. And if I asked, how many coal mines do we have in Minnesota? I hadn't asked that then either. 0! We are sending all of our money to other states, especially North Dakota, to buy both coal and bring it in on as many as 5 unit trains. A unit train is a 100-car train. Like 5 loaded cars with coal come in every day to Minnesota, paying someone else for coal. Or the other way we do it, which is they can produce the electricity in North Dakota and send it on transmission lines into us. But now the answer is 0% by 2035 will be coming from coal. This is the first amazing thing that we did. We did a lot to do this at Fresh Energy, but so did a lot of other people. And so we are getting out of the coal business in Minnesota. That's enormous news. And I've spent a lot of time at the legislature recently, but the other set of people who don't write laws, all the laws are written if they're passed, and they weren't, for many years, no laws were passed, essentially, on climate. That's the premise of the legislature. But the regulators at this group called the Public Utilities Commission, 5 commissioners that are all appointed by different governors. They all have 6-year terms, and their job is to make sure the utilities do all the laws while also following all environmental policy. So that's a big deal. That's a very big deal, because it means the PUC knows exactly what is happening at the international climate summits, knows what they are trying to do, and always checking at every utility is doing the most that they can to do that. All right, so in 2022, Xcel Energy, our biggest utility, had to go in front of the Public Utilities Commission, and they had to say how they were going to provide electricity to all of their existing and new customers, and how they were going to do that while keeping the rates affordable and 100% reliability of the electric grid. For obvious reasons, because we live in a very hot summer place and a brutally cold winter place. And we know how important reliability is. But also, every utility has to demonstrate, prove to the PUC that they are doing everything they can to uphold every environmental law in Minnesota, as well as coming out of Congress. So that is very interesting. So when I was watching this approved by the PUC in February of 2022, it said that Xcel has dates set to retire every coal plant. They're going to build this unimaginable amount of megawatts of new renewables and storage. They are going to build new major transmission lines, but they are not going to build any new natural gas or fossil gas projects, because those are almost as bad as a coal plant. And they're also going to they are asking the federal regulators for approval to extend the lifeline of their 2 nuclear plants by about another 10 to 20 years. That is carbon-free energy. All right. So the result of that is that the electric supply, who here gets their power from Xcel? I do. By 2030, it will be 80% carbon-free. The next year, it will be 81% carbon-free. Isn't that amazing? When I heard the lobbyist for Xcel Energy say these numbers in the public, I immediately put it on Twitter, and I asked all my followers who live in the other 49 states, how many other states are having their biggest utility say this? None. So the first one to say that was Xcel Energy. And then it have now been joined by about 20 other utilities. But the first one was Xcel. All right. So we're now at the end of a legislative session. But the first thing that passed out of the House and the Senate and went to Governor Walz and was signed was the 100% carbon-free energy by 2040 law. Signed it on February 7th. It sets a new renewable energy standard. By 2035, all the energy is going to be 55% renewable. And the carbon-free electricity. Look at the last 2 bullet points first. Those 2 apply to every utility in the state. Every other utility has to be 90% carbon-free by 2035. 5 years later, they need to be 100% carbon-free. There was a little hoo-ha started up by the cooperatives who said, well, you wanted all of us to get to be 80% carbon-free by 2030. We don't think we can get there soon enough. So they won on that one. But they're still going to have to get to 90% carbon-free by 2035 and 100% by 2040. That is great news. So that is the long road we're on. Not so long, less than 17 years. We're going to have to be there. And you can see by what Excel said that they've already said 2 years ago that they could get there 80% by 2030. So that's how we knew they could do it. And they admitted to that in the legislature. The second bill that is now waiting on Governor Walz's desk is the second thing we felt it was most important to get through the Minnesota legislature. And it has passed both the Senate and the House. It establishes a state competitiveness fund to use some of our $17.1 billion lying around and use $115 million of it in the last bullet point here for Minnesota to bring matching funds to help draw the federal funds to our state. You have to do both. You have to match some of that. You need to put some goodwill forward and say that your state is going to pay some of this too. Though it is amazing, there are still 6 states among the 50 who haven't taken one initiative yet to establish their state's matching fund. So I guess they're going to decide to just let the free federal money go. It's beyond stupid. But it was the definition of what Minnesota was like before our election in November 22, because we still hadn't created the competitiveness fund. But now we've got it. I know that Governor Walz is going to sign it. You'll see the news on this early next week. So there are now a number of other bills that are being passed, and they're both omnibus bills, and they're soon to become super omnibus bills. But the one in the Senate is a little bit different in many places than the House bill is. So over the next week or two, they will be going into these very prolonged, very early in the morning, and very late at night to sort out what they want in the joint bill, because you can't have two different laws. So they have to sort out what they want from the Senate bill and what they want from the House bill. So you can turn to us and look for our updates every week on our website, fresh-energy.org, because we will let you know how it's working out. But I tell you one thing, I have been at many committee meetings since January 3rd and seen committee after committee in the House and in the Senate pass these bills. And what they always say, the committee chairs always say, the author of the bill is asking us to pass the bill, and when it will, if it will pass, it will be laid over for consideration of being part of an omnibus bill. And those parts of it have all been put in the omnibus bills. So it doesn't mean they're all going to make it to the version that's voted on and signed by Governor Walz. So I'm going to skip through a couple of these. But it really means on this road to making our electricity 100% carbon-free. It doesn't get us off the hook. Because remember that map of the U.S. when I showed 27% of all the emissions coming from the 12 Midwestern states? It's not all electricity. We're a big agricultural state. Transportation is our #1 source. What we drive has to change pretty soon, agriculture, we're a big manufacturing state, we're a big industrial state. So we're going to end by solving the really big challenges. Green fertilizer, using hydrogen created by electrolyzers, which use renewable energy to separate out hydrogen from oxygen and water. That's step one. We need to figure out how to make green steel in Minnesota. And we need to figure out how to incentivize farmers to grow something other than corn or beans to store carbon in the soil. There are now 3 agribusinesses based in Minnesota: Cargill, General Mills, and Land O'Lakes, that are working on piloting that. And you know what's interesting? About 2 years ago, they started meeting. All these competitor agribusinesses started meeting together to talk about what they were learning in the pilots that they're funding. And that is the number one thing about getting businesses to work together that the lead diplomat, John Kerry, talked to me about and talked to his audiences about. He said, we need to really go gung-ho on pilots because there are some things we do not yet know how to do. Pilots mean that some pilots will not work. The really very critical thing is for you, if you're doing a pilot and you find out it's not working now, doesn't mean it will never work, but you need to start being very transparent with other people in your sector, that your competitors, because what thing would be most useless would be for someone to try out piloting something for green fertilizer, and they discovered it doesn't work right now in this way. Let your competitors know. Imagine how horrible it would be 2 years after you've had a failed pilot for someone else in your same sector to try the same pilot because they don't have information about what didn't work. Because they can change the pilot and try something else. And that's what people are really hoping many more companies around the world will start doing. All right, I'm going to say the third thing that was put into both these omnibus bills. And it was led by Representative Patty Acom, who is the chair of the Climate and Energy Committee on the House side. She's from Minnetonka. Maybe some of you live in Minnetonka. She said, we really need to update our climate goals to take into account the U.S. commitment to the world and the IPCC's latest study. And it now says, the law now says, if it passes and survives in the omnibus bill, which I think it will, we are going to reduce statewide greenhouse gas emissions across all sectors, not just electricity, by at least 50% by 2030, sounds like the Biden commitment, and to net zero emissions by 2050. And that will appear in law as soon as this one omnibus bill gets created and is signed by the governor. She also added this, I'll let you read it yourself. It was her idea, because she is very concerned about equity and inequities just running rampant in Minnesota, and to start not causing more problems for the poorest and most under-resourced among us. You shouldn't harm those people more than others of us. So I used to say that for the years that I've been giving talks like this, but now with so much hope, because now we have a fighting chance to slow down global warming enough. I used to say about what our latest win was, I used to say something like, but not quite this, we did everything we could to fight global warming. And then in 2015, I got called up by President Obama's office. This was on a Thursday. They left me a voicemail. And the voicemail said, Jay, President Obama is going to be releasing his Clean Power Plan on Monday in Washington. And he's going to have a big event in the East Room. But he wants to have a 1-hour event with people from interesting states. 12 people to meet with him privately for an hour. Would you come? And I said, of course. Of course, and I made that happen. And somebody who was watching me, she heard the president say this. And she said, you know, I just heard President Obama use your quote. And I said, not quite. Because if you listen to me say this over and over, I say this, and then I go on and say, we have to tell the kids not born yet in Minnesota that we did everything we could to fight global warming, and it worked. And that is what we have to make sure happens based on these 2 federal laws, joined now by this amazing Minnesota law that puts us in a very much leadership position. And at this table out here where you signed in, there's another sign-in sheet. If you want to get free updates, which are once a month from Fresh Energy, you can sign up and won't cost you anything. You can just figure out what Minnesota's Fresh Energy is working on, and what if the Humanists of Minnesota want to send around an appeal, a call that you're going to make to your representatives. We can tell you how we worded it, and you can use what you like out of that. Thank you very much, and this is how to reach me. But now I'd like to open it up, and do people need a, here is our microphone. Maybe you can come to it, or you can just speak loud. Tell me what questions you have, please. Any questions?
With regard to the map of the U.S., where the Midwest had, what, 27% of the emissions, and kind of the Virginia, states around Virginia had 26 and 27, yeah.
Yeah.
Is that because there's a lot of methane produced by livestock farming in those 2 areas of the country? Is that included in those numbers?
It is included, but so is every other source. And from every state that I know of, the #1 source of greenhouse gases is transportation. Every state. By the way, this map, when I was at the Global Summit the year before, I had the last year's numbers, and at that year, that was in 2021, the Midwest was emitting 28% of all emissions. The Southeast was emitting 26%. Why the number has gone down for the Midwest is Minnesota and some of the many adjacent states are doing a much better job with renewable energy. And they are switching away earlier than they thought from coal. So we're seeing the coal signal die out. But these are still big numbers, and it's clear that we can't get to a US 50% emissions reduction unless we improve every sector, because there's so much. You can't just pick one. Maybe you could in your work or in my work, but we have to remember those 7 pillars of decarbonization. There is a lot of harder sectors that we have to work on. as well. And are you queuing up here for the questions? Thank you.
I think we are. Let's see. Maybe this works. I don't know. Oh, look at that. Thank you for the good information. I hadn't seen that before. I'm not pleased about where we're at, but there it is. Want to go to the slide, or was thinking about the slide where you talked about some other big efforts. You know, you mentioned about the coal production, but the other ones, the green fertilizer, and the other one I thought about was about farmers growing something different than corn and soy. So on those two topics, I feel like I read something about the hydrogen, and I wasn't quite clear from what you said. Is it ready to be used yet on the green fertilizer, or is that still kind of in the lab and not yet commercially available?
Yeah, it is getting very close to be commercially available.
Okay.
And where I've been is to talk to the researchers at the University of Minnesota Morris, who they've gotten federal grants and state grants to help them figure out how to make green hydrogen as a step toward getting green ammonia. And just to make sure everyone knows, farmers use a lot of fertilizer, and 0% of it comes from Minnesota. It means they're buying fertilizer mostly made from fossil fuels into Minnesota. And so they're looking in Morris, they're quite a group of entrepreneurs. They're looking at how to make this. And as well, there's another effort all around Minnesota, and this is from the ethanol plants. They also know that they can, more easily than any other production of any other commodity, they can separate a pure stream of carbon dioxide. And they can also use the carbon dioxide from ethanol plants to come up with other things. So there are a number of research projects in various stages all around Minnesota. And it all comes from the beauty of Minnesota, which I learned about when I came here from New York, is these are people who just try and are doing the best in so many areas than any other parts of the country. And that's why I decided to stay in Minnesota. But they're always looking to do things better, get things locally at home. And if there is a way to get carbon out of, well, like ethanol. Now, I have different opinions about ethanol. I think I was not living in Minnesota when Minnesota decided this was a good agricultural policy, but it was not a good climate policy. So what the people who own ethanol plants say, and they're right, they can capture a stream of carbon dioxide and use that carbon for other things and not put it into the air. So that's very interesting, because we need a lot of things, because we have a lot of farmers who need fertilizer. And a lot of them would not like to keep sending money to other states to bring in a fossil fuel product.
Thank you. The other point about growing other crops, and you're touching
yes.
sort of on why they might still grow the corn that would be used for ethanol. I was thinking of what other crops, or I also thinking about one audience for using those is livestock. And so if there's a trend, it seems to be to eating less meat in the population. Maybe you have numbers, maybe you have a sense of where that's going. Is that having a favorable impact yet? What other ways might that be other than just having corn and soybeans out there? Thank you.
It's really hard to see in all the data in Minnesota around the total, I mean, it almost blacks out everything else, the amount of corn and beans. More and more farmers are going to corn and beans, even now. But it was started by Cargill and General Mills and Land O'Lakes first thinking about, well, what our farmers, our farmer producers who who help feed the world in some cases. A lot of farmers are most worried, the farmers I know are most worried about whether their kids will want to take on the farm when they die. And that is a very, the kids don't know if there's going to be enough money for them to do this, you know. And one thing is, farmers of all ages are starting to look for a way. A lot of them are thinking about regenerative agriculture and know that there are ways they can get the soil to store more carbon. And if they can prove they can do that, and it's going to be for like 1,000 years stored carbon, then a lot of these big agribusiness companies are starting to think about doing pilots to see how do we make it easy to test the soil so we know that they're really storing the carbon, and how do we get enough money to make it of interest to the farmers to do this. Because what farmers are very interested in, that I work with, they're thinking about having another source of good revenue always every year. And they're thinking about ways of storing carbon and finding a way to get this revenue. But also a number of farmers, and I'll give you the example. There's going to be the second largest solar farm built near Byron, Minnesota, in southeast Minnesota. It was just approved 5-0 by the PUC. And the county this solar farm is going to be in is 91% prime farmland. And one of the PUC commissioners lives around this area and used to farm down there, and then was a Minnesota legislature, and then got the job as the PUC. And he says, you know, I've talked to a lot of people in that county, a lot of farmers, and they say, there's no, you know, the amount of farmland that would be taken away for this one large solar farm, it would not endanger the use of prime farmland in Minnesota. What would endanger the use of prime farmland in that county is more and more farmers are asking me, how is it that we could take the worst farmland on our farm? And everyone who farms knows this, where their worst farmland is. The one that has never produced as well as the rest of their farm. Because it's too low and flooded, or it's too dry, or it's too hilly. And lots of farmers would like to put that land into a solar farm or a wind farm because they like the idea of getting 5% or 10% of their income coming in as monthly payments. That seems to make sense because farmers are very practical people. And they know, take the worst farmland out of farming for temporarily, try it for 20 years and see how it goes. See how the numbers add up. And so that is why the PUC voted for this 200 megawatt solar farm, because it's surrounded by lots of prime farmland. But it doesn't keep people off prime farmland. And there's plenty of other farmland to put the solar farm on. Yeah, because it doesn't take, a solar farm or a wind farm doesn't take up much farmland at all, because even a wind farm, you can plow right up to the base of the turbines, and it only takes about 0.3% of a farm's land out of production for roads to get to and from the turbines, and a footprint for the turbine itself. So make sure you're aware of that things really have changed for farmers. Yes.
Thank you so much, Jay. I want to find out what you think about carbon capture pipelines. In fact, I was surprised to see that that was one of the points for Minnesota looking at it. And I'd been reading some in my limited knowledge and reading about that. It seemed like the people, the companies that were really pushing it were the big gas and oil companies, the CEOs of that, and it just seems like that's going to prolong the fossil fuels instead of using that time and energy on looking towards actually fresh energy, energy-free. So I'd just like to hear what you have to say.
Yeah. Well, there are a couple of different things that you're talking about, so I'll say what I support. Carbon capture and storage is just as it can be in combination with direct air capture, which it was, carbon capture and storage and direct air capture. Some of you know that there are some very small operations that have started in places like Norway. Iceland has some of these. They have direct air capture where they are they're building like units the size of a rail car or something like that. And you can pull from the air carbon dioxide, but it's very expensive right now. But they're trying it, they're piloting it to see how it'll work. Because in Iceland, they live right over the ideal geology, which means that if you capture the carbon dioxide from the air, you liquefy it, and then you send it down a pipe below the water table to very stable geology. That is what Iceland has. If you go down far enough, you can take carbon dioxide, and in about a year or two, the carbon dioxide that goes down like a couple of kilometers, that carbon dioxide will do what's called mineralize. It will become a rock. When it becomes a rock, it's not going anywhere. So that's a good idea. So I'm very much in favor of looking at pilots for that, because we know the downside of that is we, the United States, has been the #1 source of greenhouse gas emissions since the Industrial Revolution. So a lot of our relatives who we never even knew were driving their Ford car and putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and it's still there. And it's still there means that we'll have to take some of it out, a lot of it out, if we want to, set a limit on how much global warming we have, which we need to do. So we should be prototyping more of those things. But you need to be putting carbon dioxide underground where no one uses it for anything, because it turns into a rock. And there's a lot of research out of the US Department of Energy and all of the geophysicists I know of around the country that I've been talking with. I talk with a lot of them every week because they think it is possible to do that. So that doesn't mean using the carbon to get more oil out, but that is what some people want to do. That is why when we write laws, we have to make clear what we allow in the law and what we don't allow. And the gold bar, the gold standard, is to make sure if you are able to afford, and someday it may be affordable to do this, to capture carbon dioxide, you need to be putting it and lock it in the ground. And you don't get more carbon dioxide out of there. So, in fact, every institution in the United States and around the world includes direct air capture and carbon capture and storage like that, as needs to be part of the solution. Because if you just leave our long ancestors and some of my earlier years of adding carbon pollution to the atmosphere, that will all still be there. And you have to find some way to get it out. What other people are doing is figuring a way, if they can think how to capture carbon and make it affordable to do, which has not happened yet. There are other things you could make. You could take carbon dioxide out of the air and use that carbon to make cement. So not create cement from other things that put more carbon dioxide in the air. That is also the right way to do. But the truth is, I have never seen any study that shows having zero carbon capture and mineralization of this carbon dioxide. I've never seen anyone show. Some people lie about this. And I know it's very hopeful to say that we wish that all of our society could be powered just on solar power and wind power and batteries. I don't know a study that shows that happening yet. Doesn't mean I'm not hopeful that there will be. But right now, you can see that we need to do so much if we care about our kids and our grandkids. It's so much that we need to do that is all very important. And you need not to cause other problems, but there are ways to do this. And I'll maybe end with this last story, because some people heard me say that Xcel has set the date for closing all its coal plants. And so have all the other utilities that own a coal plant. There's only one other utility that does, Minnesota Power. Their big utility is called the Cohasset plant. It's just 3 miles west of Grand Rapids. It is going to close by the end of 2035. Well, I've heard young people in the audience say, well, Jay, if a utility can no longer sell their coal-fired power in our state of Minnesota, couldn't they just keep generating this electricity? Instead of selling it to Minnesotans, sell it to Iowans. And I said, that's why you have to read the law. And I've shown them the law written in Minnesota that says every one of these coal plants has to stop generating on a certain date, and then they need to demolish the plant. That also is in the law. That's why laws are really important. You need to write them so that they get what you want. And you want that coal producing, CO2 spewing, you have to get it to be destroyed. And that's what's going to happen in Minnesota. That's good. We need more manifestations of that in other sectors too. Maybe take a couple more questions?
Quick question.
Okay.
Do you think community solar gardens are going to play a huge part in Minnesota's transition to renewable energy?
They already are.
Do you know if there's a cap on how big those community solar gardens can be, and can you tell us what that cap is?
There were bills that were heard and were passed in committee, and the cap we've been looking at are 10 megawatt. So now
Are they currently?
At most 1 megawatt, so that would be 10 times larger.
When,
We don't know. We don't know what these omnibus
Do you
bills,
know when that'll be rolling over?
I think it'll be decided what gets in the omnibus bill, so we're going to find that out in probably 2 weeks or less.
Do you think it'll be quickly implemented then?
I don't know. Yeah, there's a lot. Not everyone is agreeing on everything about community solar gardens. Yeah, but we hope so.
I want to thank you, Jay, for your work, both internationally and here in Minnesota. It's really a message of good news, and I really appreciate that. I'm still very concerned about the opposition, the petro-states, the fossil fuel companies that are as big as petro-states, and our own government's subsidies to those entities and stuff. Can you talk about the fight to the opposition and how the opposition is working against us?
Yeah, there is a big opposition. We've seen it very vocal in Minnesota, everywhere. So I'm worried about it too. But the thing is, if we're working together as 195 countries to try to do something, and we're going to go this year in November in the United Arab Emirates, and that is the first year that every country is going to be asked and drilled about how they're going to strengthen their climate laws and how much more rigid are they going to make them, including the petro-states. And it really is, it is actually a good thing to be in a petro-state, because they have to be part of this too. We're not going to get there without everyone very much making their climate laws much more robust and much more aggressive. And it includes petrostates. So it's going to be tough. But you shouldn't be saying, well, we could only be having these conferences in California or Massachusetts. That's not the way the world is. So follow me when I go there, and I'm going to be very much on social media from there. But this does have to happen. So you can't make it happen without being in a room talking to these people and being able to get them to change their ways. And I don't think the petrostates would be coming here if they really thought they were going to get away with this. That's what they're trying to do. I know that is obvious. But there are so many other ways that people can make money off energy. But we need to get off fossil fuels very, very quickly.
My question is, when you mentioned growing products produce other than beans and corn, it made me wonder, do you collaborate or connect much with Native communities who do sustainable farming of those and other produce?
Yes, we always talk to Native communities about everything that we do. Yes, always.
Couple quick questions. One
Okay.
is about, you mentioned about the corn and beans stuff,
Yeah.
For agriculture. I thought organic agriculture and, using things like compost and things for
Yeah, I
fertilizer.
can't quite.
I
Oh,
thought things like talking about agriculture, like corn and beans, I said, okay, well, why not just go to organic agriculture, this kind of thing. The other thing about carbon capture, I think, do plants do that naturally, like take the carbon dioxide out of the air and produce oxygen, something like that?
Well, you have to be sure that when carbon is captured, which plants do, but when you cut down the plant and sell them, then
Yes.
the plant is usually burned for something, like,
Yes.
or it makes ethanol.
I
So
was
that
wondering-
releases CO2 into the atmosphere.
Yes.
So
I
what a lot of
understand that.
a lot of the agribusinesses and also the organic community
Yeah.
is trying to find ways that you show that different, sometimes different methods of production
Yes.
of corn could be better, but we need many more studies so that we can show what the soil is then holding and how long it holds it.
Yes, so it enriches
So-
the soil.
Yeah.
As
And
a-
you want the carbon to stay in the soil.
yes.
So you can't just do no-till agriculture
Oh,
for
no.
1 year
No.
and then go back in the next year, you dig up everything, you plow everything up. Well, that releases the carbon.
Yes.
So it's a harder problem. It's why it's one of the hardest sectors.
You might have heard of carbon insetting. Carbon insetting instead of carbon offsetting, but there's a company that does this with they do chocolate. They make cocoa beans, but basically they make it much more like a forest. Like they plant the cocoa plants, but they also plant timber trees and fruit trees. That way, the people actually they're producing.
Yeah.
Their farmers are actually getting more money because they're selling the fruit. But the sustainable forestry, like in 30 years, the trees that they planted, they can actually be harvested in this, just a little bit at a time instead of clear cutting for forestry. You basically cut a few trees, but meanwhile you still got all the others. So it's much more natural that way. But you're still sequestering your carbon.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
This is a whole set of issues that we have to solve. And one reason why people are looking directly right now at 2030 and trying to get 50% reductions in the easier places, like electricity and in our homes, in buildings, by 2030, is that those things can happen now. We already have the technology, we now have the money, and we need to get emissions down by 50% to give us a chance to solve the other things. It's why I also when I talk about nuclear power, and I hear someone talk about nuclear power. There is no way any size nuclear plant is going to get built by 2030.
Wow.
So we need to zero in very carefully on 2030, what we know how to do, and now we have money to do it. And that is shifting over to renewable energy and much more energy efficiency.
Thank
And I'll
you.
take one more question.
No, I'm just going to wrap us up.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Jay, for coming and speaking to us. And one of the things I'm really encouraged, and just want to remind us of that slide, you said all those things in those bills we can do personally to electrify our own lives
Yes.
more. I've been thinking about that. I
Yes.
bought a new gas range
Mhm.
a few years ago.
Mhm.
I wasn't thinking.
Mhm.
I mean, and I'm not going to replace it now, but my next time. Anyway, but we all need to be thinking about this in our lives right now, what we can do. And I appreciate that
Yeah,
slide.
and think about that 10 years, the first 10 years. In 2032, the money will not be stopped because everyone who's using that money will be getting better and cheaper energy. And their lives will be improving. And they will come to Washington, D.C. and say, we need more of this because now I no longer have to tell my child, think about having a kid. We are taking a proactive thing. And so in this next 10 years, you don't have to plan for how you're going to change around everything in your house in 1 year. You can start to think and talk to people and find the best installers and see how check with your best friends and your relatives and your neighbors. You can all share information and find out the best path forward for you.
Righto. Well, thank you again for being here. And everyone, hope to see you back. We'll be downstairs next month for our annual meeting. But now enjoy refreshments and socializing with one another. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming.
Thank you all.